Thanks for joining us today. I'm Angie Sosa, she, series pronouns. I'm the Associate Director for Off-Campus Engagement. I'm joined today by my colleague, Chris DeFranzo from the Career Center, who's going to help us out with some information about budgeting and negotiating with your lease. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. This is being recorded for folks later on. But Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Angie. Hello everyone. We're gonna make our way through a couple of different topics today. Um, if questions come up, just pop them into the Q&A. We might deal with them as we go. We might deal with them at the end. We'll kind of see where they fall into the place. But let's kind of jump right in. So, in terms of what we want to talk a little bit about today, a little bit about building a budget and a little bit about negotiating your lease. That's really where we want to go. So let's start today on the budget side. I always like to kick off with what I like to call the most important slide. Pretty much every presentation I have has a most important slide. And here the most important slide really covers the profit equals revenue minus expenses. We don't need formulas or anything like that. And yes, there are going to be a little bit of math, if you will, because we'll talk a little bit about your budget. We need to understand what money's coming in, what revenue you have coming in. It could be through work, it could be from financial aid, it could be from other sources, it could be from family. There's lots of different ways that revenue can come in. And then we got to think about your expenses, and that's really all the math. The expenses is what you spend your money on. It could be rent, it could be food, it could be books and things. It could be enjoyment, it could be travel home, it could be whatever it might be. So we need to understand the money coming in and the money going out to figure out, is there any money left over? If there's money left over, then we can usually save for goals. We can do other things. That's a little bit different from today's talk, but this is kind of where we kind of build the foundation for all things financial. So want to kind of have that as our frame of reference, which is why I really call this the most important slide here. Um, the other thing to think about sometimes is folks might say, but I don't have a job during the academic year. Or maybe I do work a little bit, 5, 10 hours a week somewhere on campus, and there's not enough money coming in for me to cover my costs, cover my expenses. Um, and so then we have deficit spending. Deficit spending really just means that you're spending more than what's coming in. So in this case, we would have a negative profit. Our expenses are larger than our money coming in. Um, and some students think to themselves, or some people think to themselves, should I afford it 100% of the time? Should I never, ever, 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 ever deficit spend? And well, the answer is we try to avoid it. We try to avoid it as often as we can. However, sometimes there are situations where it happens, and it happens purposefully. It happens thoughtfully. So let's imagine that you worked over the summer and you earned the $3,000. Pick a number, and you say, okay, I'm going to use those dollars over the course of the academic year when I'm not working. I'm not going to work during fall semester, but I'm going to use those $3,000. And a semester is, 10, 13, 15 weeks, whatever it is. So you take that $3,000 and you divide it by the number of semesters you've got, a number of weeks you've got in that semester. I apologize. And what ends up happening there is you can then say, okay, so each week I know that my revenue, moving from my savings into my checking account so that I can spend it, is X amount of dollars. So technically you are deficit spending because you're not earning new money each week that you're spending it, but you're thoughtful about how you're doing it and you did some planning ahead of time. So sometimes we actually do it planfully when we are students. When you're off in the working world after graduation, and you have your full-time job and you're doing your thing, typically we would then not set up a situation where we would regularly deficit spend. We would then have, our expenses be smaller than what our revenue is or what our income is each paycheck. So that's kind of the way we think about it. And this is where I want to kind of foundationally build everything off of, is that, we're going to have some money coming in, we're going to have some money going out, and, what's left over is what we're going to kind of, aim for our goals. So as we start to think about that revenue, the most common ways of getting revenue is getting paid for your work. So we'll talk a little bit in a moment about what's kind of on a paycheck. Um, there could also be students who are on financial aid, and those students might, because of the aid award that they get in a particular semester, might end up with receiving some funds. Because of signing for a student loan, might end up receiving some funds, and those funds can then be used to live off of. So a financial aid check is one of the ways that you could happen. I mentioned, money saved during winter or summer break. I didn't write down here, but it could also be funding from family. So there's a lot of different ways that money could be coming in. Um, as I say, the most common way is a paycheck. And so what I want to do is just kind of take a moment and we'll dig into what a paycheck looks like. So this is going to have me adjust my screen share for just a moment so we can actually take a look at an Excel spreadsheet that has just a really a fake paycheck. But we can kind of walk through some of the items that are on it. So as we look at this employee pay stub, and again, it's something that I've kind of made up for illustration purposes. We'll have some general information on a pay stub. Great, your name and your employee number. We're going to look at the last paycheck for the year of 2024, so the last paycheck of last year. And what we see here is, this person was making $15 an hour, which is minimum wage here in Massachusetts. If they work overtime, which is more than 40 hours in a week, they earn what's called time and a half, or 15 times 1.5. So that's where the 2250 comes in. So if they worked every single week, would make $600 a week, $31,000 in a calendar year. We use the last paycheck because it gives us those total numbers, so it's a little bit easier to see things. What happens in a paycheck is that a lot of expenses just kind of leave before you ever get paid. And what I mean by ever get paid is before money ever drops into your checking account. So what happens is there are the taxes between FICA, which is Social Security tax, and Medicare tax, which all of us pay into here in the US. And those dollars then help our parents and grandparents, people that are in retirement over age 65, to go off and get a pension, if you will, from the federal government, and also have health care. So we pay into that system for, the older folks here in the US. We also have federal income tax at the US level. We also have state tax. This is the Massachusetts level. And then I also included some other things that aren't necessarily going to be happening when you're a student, but when you're a full-time worker, you might have your health insurance, your dental insurance, other work benefits that you might be paying for. So as a student, you will still see these four. You'll see Social Security and FICA, you'll see federal, and you'll see state income tax. After you graduate, you'll see probably those bottom ones as well. So what happens is before you even get any dollars landing in your checking account, these expenses get pulled out of your paycheck. If you're working full time, you'll also see some other employer paid benefits. That's your employer letting you know, hey, we're giving extra money for you. If you're working full time, you might have vacation that accrues. So all of these things will oftentimes appear on your pay stub. What I really want to key on, though, is that the $31,200 in this case is the gross pay. But you can't build a lifestyle off of that because you're not going to end up with $31,200 landing in your checking account over the course of a year because of all of those taxes and potential benefits that you're paying for. So we kind of scroll down a little bit further and we see our current gross for this week was $600, $31,200. All those numbers move lower from up above. And then our current deductions, that's all the taxes and benefits and things like that, is $192. We end up having $10,000 worth of deductions for the entire year. So what we see is the money that actually drops into our checking account is $407 a week in this example. Not an exact number, but it's a ballpark, which really means that we have a lifestyle that we can live of $21,000. So if we're building our lifestyle on 31,000, we're already deficit spending. So again, this is kind of some of our foundational piece, right? We figure out the money coming in is our revenue, is our paycheck in this case, but there's money coming out even before we pay rent, before we pay for food, before we pay for anything. So we need to make sure that we're thinking about that as we're starting to build our budget. This is also true if you're working as a student. You won't necessarily have those benefit costs, but you will have those taxes that are going to happen. And you'll kind of know how much you might be taking home each week by working your 5 hours or 7 hours or 10 hours, somewhere here on campus. In the summertime, you'll be working more hours. But again, you'll still be paying some of those taxes as well. So just kind of keeping all that in mind, because that helps us build a much, much stronger foundation. So the other side of this equation is the expenses side. And so what we'll do here is actually we'll take a quick look at what an expense sheet might look like. So if we were to switch over my Excel spreadsheet to my expense sheet. So now that we have an understanding of what's coming in, we then want to see how are those dollars going to be spent? How does it go out? And so we have a sheet here that we can send out to folks, which looks at your different expenses. And it's really just a simple spreadsheet. And you don't have to use this spreadsheet. You can use anything. You can use your an app on your phone. You can use pen and paper. You can use Excel, whatever might work for you. And what we can do is we can start to build in some of the numbers that we're going to be spending. This is how, again, we can figure out the expenses side. So the revenue side is one thing, money coming in from multiple sources. We know that we have some expenses if we're getting paid because of taxes. And then we have the stuff we spend things on. So one of the things we're thinking about is living off campus, right? So if we live off campus, we've got to pay rent. And maybe that's $1,000 a month. And so we can kind of plug in the number. What that does is it carries it down, calculates your household total, and then brings it over for you to the right-hand side. So we can figure out, are we going to have internet? Do I have to pay for my cell phone? What types of utilities do I have to pay for? Do I have to pay for electricity in the house? Do I have to pay for gas for like cooking? What types of things do I need to cover? And what types of things are already covered by the landlord? Are they paying for the water? Are they paying the sewer bill? These are all bills that are going to exist, and somebody has to be responsible for them. So, maybe your gas and your electric, maybe this is $20 and this is $100, whatever the numbers may be. So you can plug those numbers in and get a feel for what your monthly expenses are going to be. We also have things like insurance expenses, and this tool is used not only as a student, but it can also be used as your life kind of progresses and you move into that work world. If you have a car on campus, if you're a junior, senior, you might need car insurance. You can also think about having something like renter's insurance to protect your stuff when you're living off campus. The homeowner will have homeowner's insurance that protects the building, but your stuff is protected by renter's insurance. Again, not something you must have, but it is something that is an option for you. We also look at your transportation expenses. So, if you're taking the T, if you're going to take classes at the SMFA and you're jumping on the Green Line, you got to make sure that you have your T pass. If you're working over the summer, you might have a monthly T pass. If you are driving, you might have to pay for gas. You might have to pay for parking to park your car somewhere. So all of these things you can start to build in. So, you have a $70 a month T pass. Great. So, that just gets added into the whole system. We come up here to food and things like that. These are kind of your vitals, right? You have to have a household, you have to have a roof over your head, you have to have clothing, you have to be able to eat. Those are the key things. So your groceries, might be $250 a month. Maybe you eat out for lunch a couple times a month, and so that's, $20 a month or whatever the number might be. There's a couple of, Tuesdays where you meet up with some friends. Clothing, laundry, making sure if there's no laundry in your apartment, you gotta cover the cost of that. So we've got to build all these things in. And again, as we plug in numbers, it calculates and then it moves it over to the right-hand side. Some other basic expenses, whether it's student loans, other things like that. And then we have our discretionary expenses. These are things that aren't required for you to spend money on. They are choices. Gifts to family, streaming, going out, those types of things. Now, this doesn't mean that this section should be zero. It should not be zero. You should actually enjoy yourself. However, if we start to look at the numbers and we start to see some of the streaming numbers, are equivalent to rent, which if you have a lot of things might be the case. So, that is a place where you might say, oh, here's a way that I might be able to reduce my budget. I might be able to cut down some of the costs in terms of what I am spending. And then just to kind of finalize this tool, which I say we are going to share with folks, what it does is it calculates everything that you've got from each of these different sections. And people can edit these sections. It matters kind of what matters in your life or happens in your life. It calculates your total monthly expenses, and then it calculates the annual number. We can do the exact same thing that we looked at a moment ago. The net income from the pay stub, I think, was like $400, and we got paid weekly. So what this does is it says your monthly income and your monthly expenses. If your monthly expenses are greater than your monthly income, we're in the deficit spending mode. Do you have other funding sources? So do you have things like additional student loan money, money from family? Are you working, saved money over the summertime? Are there other sources of income that are happening? If not, we might have to figure out how to cut expenses so that we can reduce the amount of cost, or we might say, oh, maybe I will work this semester on campus. But doing this ahead of time enables you to go into the process planfully as opposed to reactionary. And that's super key because if you're thinking ahead, that enables you to actually go into the situation eyes wide open and knowing what you'll need to do and how you might need to do it. So maybe we don't spend $800 on streaming. Maybe we decide that we're going to take that number to be more like, $50 a month. And now all of a sudden, we're within our budget. So it's things like that where we can start to say, how do we make some changes? What are some choices that we're going to make? Maybe the place we thought we were going to rent, we're going to rent someplace different. Maybe we're going to add in the third roommate versus only having two. And that helps to lower the rent number. So there are different ways we can kind of think about these things. So what we want to think about is that money in and that money out, and we really kind of understand kind of what's left over. And we do it in multiple stages, right? So we do it based on our income number, but then we also do it based on our expenses number. And so that's kind of the best way to think about how we want to make all of this work. And that's really the best way to kind of begin the budget process. And so let's pop back to our presentation. Um, so, so we talked about the paycheck. We kind of went through the details there. We also then talked a little bit about the expenses side, and we looked through some of the details of the money going out. And remembering the money going out comes in two stages if you're working. The first stage is the taxes and all of that. The second stage is you actually spending money to live your lifestyle and to do your thing. So that's our foundation. We build everything off of that. When you're working full time in the future, you'll build your foundation off of your money in, your money out, what's left over, and then figuring out how to save for goals. And that goal could be buying a car, could be buying a house, could be a trip, could be visiting family, could be retirement, could be lots of different things that you might choose to save money for. But this is where the foundationally, and this is why it was our most important slide, where it all kind of begins and where it all comes from. So as we continue to kind of move forward, we start to think about, okay, let's put this in the context of living off campus, because that's really what we're here for today. But now we're all on the same page in terms of how the budgeting might work. So a typical rent that we've seen, thanks to Angie for giving me a hand with some of this information, we usually see rents, in the area between $800 and $1,300 per month per person, and this does not include your utilities. So it doesn't include your electricity, doesn't include your gas for your stove and things like that. Usually it's about $150 per month per person who are living together. Your food is variable. It's obviously based on, going grocery shopping or eating out. Eating out is obviously much more expensive than grocery shopping, but grocery shopping also means doing some cooking. So, which is a great skill to actually have. We talked about your transportation, whether it's parking, whether it's gas, whether it's using the T. Your personal expenses, again, all of these things are kind of built in. So each person is going to be building a budget, and it's really important to be honest with your housemates, right? So you don't want to let everybody feel like, oh, you can afford $200 a month in utilities when really you can only afford 150. Having some of those honest conversations are really important. Sometimes they're not the easiest conversations, but it creates a much more positive environment, if you will, as things are moving forward, so that everybody can understand, what amounts we can put in and how. Some folks have partnered together to join like a wholesale club, like a Sam's or something like that, so that you can split the cost of items that you all use. Buying things like, not the most extravagant or fancy thing, but buying things like toilet paper in bulk is just cheaper. And ultimately, everybody is going to use it. We're going to, use it over the course of the year, so we can buy a large amount for a very low cost, and that's where we can save some money. I mentioned your electricity and your gas and things like that. You can call the utility company ahead to try to get a vibe or a feel for what the average cost was. If you're moving into an apartment that of somebody who so let's say the senior's moving out because they got a job and you're moving in as the junior, and the individual that lived there last year. You can ask them questions about what were their utility costs and what was it like. So therefore, again, you can be planful in terms of the amount that you're going to need as you're moving into your potential off-campus house in the following year. So again, it's planning is really the key, and it's trying to strike that balance between the amount of money you're spending on rent, utilities, and the amount of money you're spending on other things. So some folks then say, okay, well, what can I afford? Well, oftentimes we try to compare it to the cost of tuition, because we try to compare it to living on campus. So, the cost of housing, which is really based on 9 months of living, because obviously you're not here during the summertime. We have our housing and then a meal plan. And so that's pretty much looking at about $2,000 a month is really what the number comes down to, 2,065 approximately. For that we're spending, and that's over the 9 month period. Keep in mind that when you do a rental lease, it's for a 12-month period. So you do have June, July, and August that you're going to pay rent for if you're renting an apartment, because they do it based on the year, not on the academic year. So one thing to kind of keep in mind. But if you kind of do all this math and your expenses are around $2,000 a month between your rent, your utilities, your food, and all that kind of good stuff, it's pretty equivalent between living on campus and renting an apartment somewhere. Um, so the other thing to keep in mind is that, during those summer months, during those 3 months when you're not here, um, you have some choice. So you could potentially sublet the apartment. So that's one option. Or you could decide, if you end up with an internship or a job here in the Boston area, you just keep living there and then you use the money that you're earning full-time work to pay the rent. So there's a couple of different options that you might have for those summer months. Typically, your leases start on September 1. It's when a lot of folks will move, and you all likely have seen that in the past. Um, the other thing that's really important to think about is when you sign your lease initially, and when everything starts, usually you pay your first month's rent, your last month's rent, and your security deposit. So there's actually 3 months rent that you're paying pretty much upfront. Oftentimes we can negotiate down to two of the three. Usually it's your first month's rent and your security deposit. So, keeping in mind that if your rent as an individual is going to be $1,000 a month, you'll have to come up with your $2,000, 1,000 for your first month and 1,000 for your security deposit, if you're able to negotiate two out of the three. We'll talk about negotiation in just a moment. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. So once again, planful. It's doing some planning ahead of time to understand what you can afford, also understanding what dollars might be available, and then figuring out maybe, okay, I've done all the math, so now I know over the course of the summer I need to save up X amount of dollars so that I can thoughtfully deficit spend potentially during the academic year. So by having the plan ahead of time, you can now work the plan as opposed to kind of dropping into the last moment and kind of not really understanding or knowing exactly what you're walking into. That's usually when we have a lot more struggles, in terms of making things happen. So as we start to kind of think a little bit about a comparison, so we put together a small table again, thanks to Angie and her team for helping me with this. So what we've got is, we've got some numbers in terms of a comparison, looking at, juniors and seniors on campus versus off campus. And we're looking at, a single individual who is in the kind of a four-person apartment for a 12-month lease. So it's you and a few friends. And we see that the rent, if you will, or the living expenses are pretty much the same in terms of the space. 1,300, for on campus, whereas it's somewhere between 8 and 1,300 for off campus. You don't have to pay any utilities. If you're living on campus, you will have to pay some utilities living off campus. So again, if your rent is below $1,229, you're pretty much even. We then think about meal plan and we think about food, right? So, you can have a premium meal plan, you can have a much smaller plan when living on campus. Obviously, if you're renting, this varies by individual. It varies by the food that you eat, how often you eat out, the grocery store that you go to, things like that. But meals, can be a reasonable cost. Transportation is going to be the same because whether you live, you're going to be living close to campus anyways. Your personal, again, that's where the budgeting tool comes in. So our monthly totals are pretty similar. We're looking at anywhere from 1,600 to 2,300 on the junior senior side, living here on campus, to more of 1,100 to 1,800 on the off-campus side. And again, obviously, big depending on that is how much food and then how much the rent cost is. So if we look at it overall for 9 months on campus, we're looking at $15,000 to $21,000. But if we look at over 12 months, we're looking at pretty similar numbers. So that's why we say it's relatively equivalent living on or off campus in terms of a cost perspective. Everything here is an estimate, so don't quote it as an exact number. We've tried to do some ranges and some ballpark to try to get a feel for comparing the two, just to give you a little bit of a sense of it. But didn't want you to wanted you to really kind of see that the numbers are very similar, that one doesn't really kind of skyrocket and the other one is there's no huge winner in either direction. But there is nuance here, and again, that's where the planning and being thoughtful really comes in. So now that we have some kind of understanding of some of the budget, we're going to dig through, we're going to do some comparisons, we're going to kind of understand where we're at, and we're going to do some of that work planfully so we kind of know what we're walking into. The other thing that we want to think about is that there is negotiation to this process. And negotiation in itself is a process. So the way that negotiation typically works is you figure out what's important to you. Once you figure out what's important to you, you then rank those things. And it might only be one thing, so it's already ranked. It might be 5 things that are important to you. Well, 1 is going to be the most important, and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. So once we understand your ranking, now we can go ahead and start to say, what is the thing that we want in our number 1 thing? So, Angie mentioned that I work in the Career Center. Sometimes we'll think about, a salary negotiation, right? Or I got a job offer. I want to negotiate part of it. Well, it could be a salary, it could be a bonus, it could be vacation time. You have to prioritize what's important to you. When we're thinking about a rental situation, it could be your upfront fees. Remember, we mentioned your first month's, your last month's, and security deposit. Well, if I can reduce one of those and I can only have 2, that might be a great way to go about it. It might be the date you pay rent. You'd rather pay rent on the 3rd versus the 1st. I don't know. It might be the fact that the landlord doesn't want to sublet, but you do. There's different things that you could decide that's your priority. And that's the thing that you'll try to negotiate. Negotiation typically means compromise, meaning you don't get everything you want oftentimes. You give up something to get something. And the landlord will potentially do the same. But there's a process for how you typically will ask for things. And then you have to know, okay, so I've made my list. Here's my top 3 things. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's how I'm going to ask for it. And then what if I can get one of 3 answers? If the answer is yes, thumbs up, love it, we move forward. If the answer is you get half of it or a part of it, what's your response? And if your answer is do you get none of it, just a straight no, what's your response? You need to remember that you can walk away. Everybody has veto power in this process. The landlord has veto power, so do you. Same thing when you get a job offer. You can ask for more money and they can say no. And you can choose to either take that job or walk away. So you have more power in the process than you think, even though it does feel sometimes like you don't have power in the process. You too can walk away just as they can. It isn't until everybody says yes every step of the way that a deal is struck, if you will. So this is the way we kind of think about it. So how do we ask for things? Well, oftentimes we will try to ask for things in I'll say a data way, if you will. When I think about negotiating for a job offer, oftentimes I'll say I've got a competing offer and I want to work for you, but the other offer is more money. So can you match them? If I am, I could also use data and say I have this offer, and what I find is that when I look on Glassdoor or Salary.com or LinkedIn jobs, salaries are typically here, but you're paying me less. Is there any wiggle room? So there are ways we can kind of ask the question that is kind of really data driven. So you could ask the question saying, look, I want to live in your apartment because you are right next to campus, but I've got an option in Cambridge, which is like a 20-minute ride on the T, and it's a third the price, or maybe not Cambridge, but another town. So you could have that conversation with the landlord and say, look, so because of that, is it possible that I can just do first month's and last month's, or first month's security deposit and not do the last month rent? So they're now think, okay, well, I have you on the hook if I say yes to the first 2. But if I ask for all three, you might walk away, and then they've got to go through the process of finding somebody else. And the process of finding somebody else takes time and takes money and takes effort. So maybe they decide, you know what, sure, we'll take you. So there's a different ways we kind of go about it. We kind of try to use data and fact to try to convince the other individual. Oftentimes, we also sandwich the ask around, I'm excited about something. Here's what I want, and then I'm still excited about it. Really love your apartment. I think it's great. It's nearby, so there's a bunch of wins there. However, what I would like is to only pay the first month and security deposit for these reasons. And then, because again, I think that, I'd be a great fit here and I'd be happy to have you and you'd be happy to have me. So we kind of do that sandwich. Same thing happens with a job offer. So we talk about, I'm really excited for this opportunity. However, what I'm seeing is that people get paid more money. Is it possible to up the salary slightly? Because I'm super excited about joining your team. So we kind of use that sandwich whenever we go through the negotiation process. And what we see is that there is, rental lease agreements that are pretty long documents. And many of you have maybe had the chance to look at some. Many of you will not have had the chance to look at one yet. So we'll take a moment. We'll kind of walk through a standard rental lease. It's not by any means the final version of any rental lease agreement. It is, as I say, kind of a sample of one, because any a landlord can create their own rental lease agreement, but oftentimes they'll use a very similar format to something like this. So what we do is we have the two parties. We have you and the landlord. The person that owns the building is the landlord. You are the tenant. So we kind of start there, pretty straightforward. They mention the property, kind of the landlord is gonna, you're gonna get to live at this address. They put that in there because if they own two buildings, you can't just pick which building you live in, right? So it might seem strange that that's there, but there's a reason why. The terms. So the term of the lease shall be, X amount of dollars starting on which day, ending on the other day. So it kind of lets you know that it's going to be a 12-month lease. Oftentimes, there is this line that says the lease shall automatically self-extend and will be in effect month to month. Usually, landlords don't get you to that point. You don't end up going the month to month thing because they want to lock a person in for a year. So they'll either relock you in for a year or they'll move to the next group of students that are kind of up and coming because you've graduated and you're off moving somewhere else on earth. So that's kind of how that will typically work. Month to month just means that you're not locked in for the year, you're only locked in for the month. So it's more freeing for you in some ways, but it's also a little bit more risky for you because then the landlord can say, hey, you know what, next month you're not here. Whereas when you lock in for a year, you're locked in for a year as are they, as long as everybody follows all the rules that are set forth in the rental lease agreement. The rent is X amount of dollars payable on typically the first of the month, as long as the lease is in force. Following appliances and furniture. So we kind of talk about that. So stove and refrigerator are required in Massachusetts and really, I believe, pretty much everywhere in the US. Some locations in the world, that's not true. But here you need to have shelter, which is the building. You need to have a way to store food, that is your refrigerator, so that it does not spoil. And you need a way to cook that food. Those are the three things that must be there. You don't need to have laundry. That's not required. It could be there. There might be other appliances or furniture that are built in. There might not be. It really kind of depends on the place, but anything will be listed there. But notice stove and refrigerator can't be changed. So you need to make sure that, well, you don't need to make sure. Those things should be there. Your security deposit is, yeah, as we mentioned, 1 month's rent typically. They'll put in the number in terms of what it will be. And then that is money that is held by the landlord in case damage occurs, in case something gets broken, in case you don't treat the apartment well, you don't clean and you don't take out the trash, and then there are rodents or things infesting the place that weren't there before you showed up, that they'll use the security deposit money to take care of those types of items. That money is still your money. It is left in what's called an escrow account, which typically gets like a couple of pennies of interest, and technically those 2 pennies are yours. But that's kind of how that works. So that money is held separately. It can't be touched by creditors of the landlord. That's what all of this is saying. So I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but that's kind of what's going on here. The occupants of the location, that's pretty much just saying this is who's going to live here. Um, and you can't have random folks live with you for the 6, 8 months. So this is how it works. It says except any children born. So if somebody's born along the way, they get to live there with their parents. But ultimately, this is just saying these are the residents. So these are you and the people you're sharing your apartment with. All notices are in writing. So you want to make sure you're getting any notice to the landlord in writing if there's a leak, if something happened, if there's a floorboard that is cracked or something happened on the porch. You need to just let the landlord know kind of what's going on. And those notices are typically in writing, and that you can give them a phone call. But I always say send them a text, so therefore it's fast, but you can always follow up with an email. So that way you've kind of covered really all of your bases. It tells you how to connect with the landlord. There's their name, there's their address, there's their phone number, all of that kind of good stuff. We mentioned that some of the utilities you pay for and some of the utilities they pay for. So again, oftentimes they will list out who pays what utility. It's who's what's responsibility. Oftentimes water and sewer is covered by the landlord because there's really usually only one connection into a building, whereas your electricity, your gas, those can be separated much more easily. Those are typically paid by unit. So every single unit in the apartment pays their own electricity, but there's only one water feed, there's only one water pipe coming in, so the landlord oftentimes will pay the water. But all of that should be listed in terms of what is done. Sometimes trash removal is covered by the city. Somerville and Medford, they have trash removal. In some places, you actually have to pay for trash removal. So it might be the landlord or the tenant's responsibility. And then you agree to a whole bunch of things. And again, this is a sample lease agreement. So yours might look different, but it's you use the property to live in, not to run a coffee shop out of. If you're going to be gone for a period of time, a weekend, great. A couple weeks, awesome. You're on vacation, cool. If you're going to be longer than, typically 30 days or a month, oftentimes they'll say you've got to let the landlord know because if there is a leak, they need to go check on things. So they need to stop by and keep an eye on the place. You need to keep it clean and maintain it. You can't waste utilities. Even if you're paying for them, you can't just like let the water run for 17 days. You can't, open all the windows and turn the air conditioning on at full blast when it's 95 degrees out. In the end, that's not a useful use of utilities. Any damage, you have to really cover. Wear and tear, you don't. So if things kind of gradually wear out, you don't have to cover that cost. But if a light bulb blows, you can replace the light bulb. But if there's a plumbing leak in your kitchen or your bathroom, that's not your responsibility. That's the landlord's responsibility to make sure that they're taking care of those pieces. You can't make major alterations. So you can't suddenly paint walls. You can't suddenly knock down walls. You can't do those types of things. You can't change the locks. Because the landlord has to have the ability to get into the apartment, should there be a problem. You need to make sure that you're managing your noise levels. Sublets are sometimes allowed, sublets are sometimes not allowed. Really kind of depends on the apartment, and that's something that's typically in the document ahead of time. How the lease gets terminated. There's also ways around that. There's also permission for the landlord to enter the unit, and this doesn't mean that they can just show up randomly. They usually will reach out and say, okay, I'm showing the unit because your lease is going to finish up and I want the next tenants to take a look at it. Okay, great. Or I need to go in because you mentioned that there was that leak. I'm going to go fix it. I'm going to bring the plumber in. So they can't enter at any time or at all times of the day or night. But you also have to be reasonable. So if he comes in and says, or the landlord comes in, or she says, hey, we've got the plumber coming in. Are you available tomorrow at 2? And you say I have an exam at that time and it's a virtual exam. That wouldn't be great. You can negotiate that and have that conversation. But if they say, okay, well, what about the next day at 2? And you're like, no, and the next day at 2, no, and the next day at 2, no. Now you've kind of lost being reasonable. So there needs to be kind of a reason why you wouldn't allow them in. So that's just kind of, again, part of that negotiation, part of that conversation. Having that good relationship is super important. The landlord agrees to maintain the dwelling. It's their job to keep things in good working order. If the place becomes uninhabitable because of fire or natural disaster, the agreement is gone. Like they're not required to continue to house you somewhere if that house doesn't no longer exist. They notification of termination. So they can terminate the lease if you really kind of breach the rules. They have to give you written notice, and there's certain rules that they must follow. Sometimes there's an attached addendum, and actually we're going to look at one in just one second. And some of it is actually similar to some of the stuff that we saw in this general version. But that we'll look at in a second. No changes can happen unless you both agree to it, you both sign. And then here at the bottom, it even says tenant is encouraged to have renter's insurance, which again protects your personal belongings, not the building. So sometimes there are addendums, and we have a sample as well. And ultimately, again, the property and you and the landlord as are signing this. If any paragraph is in conflict, great. It's just that the lease will take control. Sorry, the addendum in this case will take control. Again, not a lawyer, but you can kind of read what's going on there. So they're noting that it's a 12-month lease, kind of one of the things that we talked about a moment ago. And then there might be certain rules. You can't go on the roof. You can only use the basement for laundry and specifically, agreed upon storage. You can't use the backyard. You're required to clean. And if pests show up in the house, and I don't mean people that are annoying, I mean, whether it's insects or rodents, if they have to come in, they'll use a security deposit. So you need to make sure that you're keeping the apartment clean. We also have to think about no pets. You acknowledge that you're going to pay a first month and a security deposit. The first month rent is due at this point in time. Security deposit is due at this point in time. Security deposit can't be used as rent. It is your security deposit. It is there just in case damage happens. And it will be managed at the end of your lease. You can only have the certain occupants. And that doesn't mean you can't have a friend over for the weekend, but you can't have a friend move in for the semester. No kegs or open parties are allowed. So, keeping an eye on that and making sure that that's actually to help protect the landlord. It helps protect you because if somebody gets hurt on the premises while you're there, you obviously could potentially be liable depending on what goes on. Again, not a lawyer or an insurance agent, but at the same time, those are things that are looked at. In this case, they're allowing some sublease agreements. So again, it's usually written ahead of time whether or not you can sublet. So you kind of know that answer about those summer months really before the whole thing starts. Tenants agree between 9 a.m. So in the end, you kind of let them allow entry, between 9 a.m. and 9. So reasonable piece for reasonable purposes. So, if there is some sort of crazy issue, again, there's a flood at 2 a.m. or an oil leak or something like that, you'll call them, they might rush in and obviously you'll want them in because, it's doing damage as we speak. So that's kind of a different thing. But for, a reasonable, we're going to do some fixing or we're going to have the apartment be shown, they're going to give you at least a day or so notice, those types of things. Again, set up ahead of time is really great because then you're protected and they're protected and they know. The whole idea of this is really just to protect both parties. So again, you insure your personal belongings, they don't. In this case, water and sewer were provided. We talked about that. Snow removal sometimes will get added. So the landlord is going to give you a path to the sidewalk. But if you have a car and you want to shovel out the car in the driveway, that's your responsibility in this case. Again, that can be agreed to in lots of different ways. When you terminate the lease, there's a specific time. You need to remove all your food from the fridge. You need to clean things. You need to clean the dishwasher and the stove. You need to vacuum. You need to leave the apartment, in broom swept condition. Same thing with the bathrooms and everything like that. They're talking about, vacuuming, sweeping, removing all your personal items. So if you leave stuff there, then they've got to move it out. And if they have to move it out, there's a cost associated with that. And that cost will typically get paid out of your security deposit. So you want to make sure that, you're moving all your stuff out. So you also understand if the property ends up for sale, it might be shown to people. But they're already saying that, if it does sell, then your lease won't be affected upon the sale. So they will kind of sell it with those leases in place. So that's kind of, again, that's not to say they're going to sell it, but they're putting it in there just in case. You're responsible for taking out the trash each week. You can security deposit can't be used as rent, all of these types of things. So most of these things are pretty straightforward. Um, and ultimately, what it comes down to is there's a lot that you and the landlord are agreeing to. But the more that you can agree to these things ahead of time, the stronger and better the relationship will be over the course of the 12 months that you're renting. So they've given you a lead law notification in Massachusetts. If the building is built before 1974, I think it is approximately mid 70s, it likely has lead paint in it or on it. And that is true. So we need to kind of notify people of that. So there's different lead law notifications that need to happen. Again, that's the state of Massachusetts. And then we agree to the lease addendum and we sign it. So it's very similar in some ways to the original document, the original lease. So what we've got here is, again, the goal is to protect you and the landlord. And having information up front with each other enables you to have a much better, again, relationship with that landlord over the course of the year. It also enables you to potentially negotiate some of the pieces and ask some of the questions. If access to the yard is super important to you, maybe you say, okay, well, if I can get access to the yard, is it possible if I can mow the lawn and plant some flowers, right? So that's a way that you might negotiate that. And the landlord might say, sure, you can, but you can't have a grill because I'm worried about fire. Okay. So you can kind of negotiate that in there if access to the yard is something that's super important to you. You're probably never going to be able to negotiate access to the roof. If you're living in like a triple decker, it's not safe. So they're just going to say no. So there are some things where we kind of know the answer, but there are other things where we might decide to ask for something. And again, most commonly it does come around the dollars and cents, kind of the opening costs of your first month's and your security deposit, because some landlords will also ask for your last month's rent. And if we can reduce that number, that actually makes it easier, obviously, to begin to rent that apartment. So I believe that kind of looking through those two pieces is our last item. My last slide, which I'm not going to bring up, just as questions. So wanted to kind of turn it over and see if there are any questions from anyone.
I'm gonna stop the recording now.